So without further ado, I'd like to present Jen Kaifesh.
Hello, everybody. Thank you again. And like she said, we really appreciate all of you in Eastern time zones and beyond making this. I know it's late, so I will talk fast and try to cover as much as possible in a short period of time. Do know at the end, we'll also send out some information. I always do free 30-minute one-on-one consultations. If you have questions about your specific kid that we don't get to answer today, you're welcome to sign up for one of those and we'll send out info on that. So just know that that is an option if you don't feel like asking something very personal about your kid, and we will go from there. But okay, so what I want to talk about today, I want to kind of walk you through what a college application entails. I know, the people who are registered, we have people that are juniors and we have students as young as elementary school. So this is great because it's going to give, some of you a sense of what's to come and others of you are already in it. But what I want you thinking of is the way colleges view applications. That's kind of the point, is like, how do you live your best life in high school to be a strong candidate? The phrase we always use is authentic but unique. You want to be true to who you are, follow your true interests. You're not just padding your resume, and you are still going to stand out from other applicants who have similar things. So one of the things that's great is when you're a scout and you have done things like, if you've achieved Eagle rank, right, and what your project is, we're going to talk about how you can incorporate that and maybe stand out from other Eagle Scouts who are applying to the same schools and not sound, the same as everybody else with the same kind of accolades. So this is your college application. Right here, if you look at this, and these stats, by the way, are all over the place depending on where you're actually applying. It's just kind of a breakdown to understand, look, high school academics is the most important, and we'll talk about that later. Same with standardized test scores. As most of you know, and we'll talk about this a little bit too later, standardized testing is in a very weird place. So during COVID, most everywhere went test optional. A lot of California schools have gone test blind, and other schools around the country, not many outside of California, but some, which basically means if you got a perfect 1600, you cannot send your scores, right? So obviously they're not 25% of the application process at those schools, but there are some schools like Georgetown and MIT and some Georgia state schools and Florida state schools, and I think UT Austin's about to do this, are going back to test required. So we'll talk about standardized testing in a little bit, but know that that is, for those of you who are hoping it might have gone away, it is still present and it can still be a benefit to your application. We'll figure that out when we talk about kind of who it plays to the strengths of. Then the stuff on the left of this lovely pie chart is the stuff that we're going to talk the most about today. Your extracurricular activities, right? And how this factors into scouting and how scouting factors into this, what kind of essays and letters of recommendation, and how, again, you can use scouting for those elements. Miscellaneous, you'll see here at 10%. I put that on just as kind of an asterisk. It's basically saying, look, everyone has a unique story. Everybody has something else that might factor in. It could be everything from connections to a university, to a great art portfolio, to being a recruited athlete, which, if you're the best football player in the country, it's gonna be more than 10%. But this is just kind of a general breakdown. So let's talk about extracurriculars. So this is how you spend your time, and what colleges care about is, are you having an impact on your community, right? So if you look at this, another lovely pie chart, there's lots of these, just a way to break things down. The thing that matters most is that you're doing something that has an impact. It can be small, but it should be meaningful. So one of the things, we had a lot of questions, and a lot of you sent in questions beforehand, which thank you, that helped us kind of organize some thoughts here, is understanding, especially when you're trying to pick your project and trying to pick how you are portraying yourself through scouting and what attributes you want to kind of highlight. The community impact, more so than even the volunteer work, is the important part. So of course you're showing leadership, you're showing volunteer work, you're impacting your community, but at the end of the day, the community impact is the big thing. So think of it from, if we're talking about Eagle, like your project, like say you have, I had a student who built a bench, right? And put it in a park. That is wonderful. That is better than the vast majority. Most people who are especially not scouts never do something like that. It benefits the community. That's wonderful. But it's also not necessarily something that is profound or serves a deeper purpose that you're connected to. So in an ideal world, when you're picking your Eagle project, or you're thinking about what you want to spend your time on, and even outside of scouting, it should be something that matters to you and has a personal connection. So what we see a lot, like what are going to make some of the best ones, think about so I actually had a student who was an Egyptian immigrant, and he was trying to figure out what he could do to help his community. And he ended up putting together a little pamphlet that was as an immigrant, and it was in both Egyptian and English, of how you rent an apartment. How do you go to the DMV? How do you do all these things that if you're a new citizen in the US, or you just have your visa, whatever it is, you can function in society. It ended up, this was his Eagle project, right? And so when he did that, he thought it was going to be like, great, I'll send it to our local community and it'll go to 15 people. But what happened was it took off, and it was so helpful that it ended up being circulated among 30,000 people. And it became this huge thing. And he ended up flying around, like, places would fly him out to help talk to, and he was talking to adults about this stuff. That is the type of project. You don't need to do something that big necessarily, but recognize the impact that that has is going to be much more powerful than building a bench. And so when you have something concrete that you can tie to your identity, you can tie to, if there was something in your family that there's a reason it matters to you, it makes for better essays, right? It makes for a more sincere storyline. So let's say you don't even achieve Eagles rank, right? You don't make it that far, or hopefully all of you will, but let's say you don't, or you're not sure what you want to do. You're doing so much important and meaningful stuff, whether it's leadership, whatever, during your scouting experience, but they want to see things that you're doing outside of scouting as well. So this is something that you will see, this is the common application that colleges will see. You get 10 blanks. So what I see a lot with scouts is that they have one of these, they check all the boxes, they've done it 9, 10, 11, some are done, with Eagle before 12, some stay involved, it depends. Hours per week, weeks per year, they're high. You have, position, whether you're a troop leader, whatever, if you got things, activity, great. So if you patrol, anything like that, you can list. But if all of your time is spent on scouting, that's one line, which is great. But what they would rather see is that you found something that mattered to you, that you got involved in or were introduced to while involved. And then the second line was you continuing with it outside of scouts. So it's going to give you a chance to show, like, oh, I was introduced to this injustice in the world, or this thing that could have been better, and I found a way to stay involved with it on my own. I was proactively seeking it out. So using scouts is almost a jumping off point. So this is something where, when you go backpacking, think of it this way. A lot of kids, by the way, this is another thing I see. When you have your list, if you're trying to explain everything you do in scouts, you have almost the administrative side of all your meetings, right? And you have your backpacking, but you have all your badge work. You have so many factors. You have 150 characters to describe all of this, which is not much. That's a tweet, right? So this is why sometimes breaking it into things, if you have a leadership position, maybe you'll talk more about that, or talk about, if you're like how patrol impacted your leadership skills. They care how it's going to impact them when you're at college. So if you think of this from the college's perspective, scouting is one of those things that shows you have all these important skills. And going back to this, right? You've got your leadership, you're looking out for your community. But at the end of the day, colleges care what you're going to offer them. And this is the reality. It's the harsh, harsh reality that they're saying, are you going to have an impact in our community? Are you going to make our world and our campus a better place? So if you're going to show them how you have become a leader through scouts, great. How have you used that outside of scouts, right? And just like we talked about impacts and volunteer work. So I want you thinking, as you're kind of developing your interests and learning what matters to you as a young adult and how you want to impact your community, just make sure that you are setting yourself up to have accomplished these things and pursued them beyond this. A lot of you asked questions about, how to mention your accomplishments in scouting that non-scouters would understand. So there's two factors to that. This is one where I would say you're likely going to have readers who understand it. Honestly, this is the main thing. You're going to have, they get so many applications. The better the school you're applying to, the more scouts there are who are applying. And they're used to reading about, Eagle this and what you did in your projects and how you achieved the rank and, when you did it and what you did after. They're used to seeing all this. So they understand the basics and the fundamentals. Your job, again, is to try to explain why it matters, right? Not just, I did this thing, I built the bench, but how does that show how you interact with your community, with your high school, with the retirement community down the street? But the subtext is always going to be, what would you be like on a college campus, right? And the idea should be you see a need and you find a way to serve that need. That's the goal. So if you have a couple examples of that, it generally makes it more like, saw this, decided to act on it, right? Saw this problem, found it, came up with a solution. So you're trying to articulate in a way that they understand why it's valuable to them as a campus and as a community. But highlighting Eagle Rank in your essays and on your applications and resumes, I think the best thing to do is think about what your other friends are doing, and not in a competitive way necessarily, but saying, if you guys all are writing about, your big trek and your big backpacking trip at the end and the culmination of your time in Scouts, and you're all writing about the same thing and how you're in the wilderness and got lost, but you figured out how to navigate back. Those can be great stories and they can be great personal statements, but a lot of Scouts write about that sort of thing. So you want to make sure that you are doing it in a way that feels, again, back to authentic but unique, that it's true to what matters to you, but you're doing it in a way that other Scouts maybe aren't phrasing it the same way, or picking the same moments and your learning experiences. If you pick something that was a small moment somewhere and not a big event, it's usually a better essay anyways, which we'll talk a little bit about more later. But leadership comes in many forms. This is the other thing. And Scouts obviously can be more formal, but just in high school, right? You can be a leader by, again, identifying a need and going out and taking care of it yourself. You can say, I'm going to coordinate a beach cleanup, right? Whatever it is, you being president, being captain, being patrol leader, whatever, there's lots of different ways. You can, do it in your clubs and your sports, in the orchestra. There's leadership that's formal and informal. They care about both. So you're also trying to show them that you know when to follow and when to lead. And director of admissions at a top university once told me that they look at applications a lot of times for kids who are really big into leadership and make sure they're still involved in things where they're following. So we want to know that kids know when to lead and when to follow, and that they aren't only involved in things they're in control of. So think of this for those of you who are very proactive and very big into leadership. Make sure that you're still trying new things and you're going in as somebody who's not necessarily in control for everything, that is going on. So again, outside of Scouts, thinking of this, your community impact can be your high school, it can be your community, it can be the international, whatever you want it to be. An example I always like to give because it's so random. So I had a student who cared about the environment. She was trying to find ways to make, we're in California, and she was trying to figure out, after, I would say the year of the drought, but those are all years now. But after a big drought, what we could do. And she discovered waterless urinals. This was her thing that she's like, this is what we can do at this high school. So she went to the high school, it was a big public high school. And the high school told her, we don't have time or money or interest or energy to try to do this. We can't replace all of our urinals. That's impossible. She ended up with like a 3-inch binder of every urinal model that existed. She reached out to every plumber in like the area and got bids and got quotes and tried to figure out with manufacturers how she could get discounts for the cause and through a public school. She went to the board, she went to, the booster club, and she got the money and she got it done. And that girl got in everywhere. Right. So again, whether we're talking about, your big project for scouting and for your Eagle Rank, or we're talking about just something you do in your spare time, the reality is that actually, even though that was, by the way, the essay again wrote itself, it was amazing. And she sounds like somebody who, again, identifies a problem and just kind of goes and solves it. But it was a fun read. It was different. It's not something that's the unique element, right? Most people don't, especially little blonde girls figuring out waterless urinals at their high school. It was different. So that's something, when you're thinking of community impact, it's finding something that is meaningful to you. This is the other thing, is as you're going through high school, back to this slide, talked about, you see here that they ask you to check the boxes for 9, 10, 11, 12. You want to have as much consistency as possible. But the reality is, for volunteer work, and again, Scouts helps with this if it's all under Scouts, but then it looks like you've done one thing. So if you've done things outside of it, or you want to break certain experiences out into their own line items, that's totally fine. But we have a lot of people that will say, well, I did a few months I went down once every 2 weeks to an animal shelter. And then a few months later, I started going to the Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure, or whatever it was. The problem with that is you're checking one box and saying 4 hours a week, 2 weeks a year, 1 week a year. And it looks like there's no passion there. It looks like you just are padding your resume with hours. So you want to think of this as, how do you connect your interests? So just like the Egyptian student, it's like that was something that clearly had meaning to him and his family. But you can also look at this as like, I had a student, I said, who do you want to help in the world, right? Where do you feel like there's a need that you want to serve? And his immediate answers were veterans and dogs. And I said, okay, so there's an organization called Pets for Vets, and they rehabilitate shelter dogs and help them become service animals for veterans with PTSD. So he got very involved in that. Again, it's something that's authentic to him. It's unique for the readers to read about. They're not used to seeing anything like that. So it's more interesting. So at the end of the day, you are trying to make it fun for them to read your application and different, because they're reading thousands and thousands of these. So the moment yours starts to sound like everyone else's, it can sometimes present a problem. Now, work experience and internships. Let's talk about the difference there and how these things factor in. So part of this, there's two types of jobs, and colleges have a preference. So one is going to be, bagging groceries, scooping ice cream, things like that. Another is going to be working at your uncle's law firm, making $30 an hour, right? The reality is they prefer the former. So they want the kid who's going to have grit and work ethic and has some humility, because if you're working a job, whether you're in retail, whether you're in service industries, you're going to have to deal with people with egos. You're going to have to deal with your friends coming in and teasing you while you scoop ice cream. They recognize all this. They also recognize that it shows you not everything's handed to you, right? You have to work for things. So they already know something about kind of your upbringing, your family, your worldview, but they also know that you're responsible enough that someone who is not related to you is willing to pay you and not fire you and trust you with their cash register or whatever it is. So those types of jobs are great. You can also come up with your own, right? This is something during COVID, I had a student who was trying to figure out what he could do to just make extra money. He wasn't doing this even for college. He just wanted cash. And he went around his neighborhood, offered to power wash out the inside of everyone's trash cans and recycling cans for $10 a can. So he's literally crawling around in all these gross cans for $10. But it became like a huge business, and he ended up bringing his friends in and they started doing it. And he ended up having a legitimate business, and again, turned into a great essay. And it was a kid who came from a wealthy area and a wealthy family. And so it almost carried more weight in that way that he was willing to do that. So it showed something about his character. So, jobs, again, sometimes there's a great internship, if you're working for NASA, right, or Boeing or something like that, they have formal internship programs that if you apply and you get in, those are amazing. If you get an internship somewhere because of a family member or a family member's friend, it depends, because a lot of college admissions reps are very familiar with who has actual internships available. So for instance, we work with a lot of students in Los Angeles, and a lot of parents or parents' friends work in entertainment. So when a kid has an internship at DreamWorks and they're like, hold on, DreamWorks doesn't offer internships to people under 18, they can do the math and realize that somebody just gave it to them. That kid may be incredible and super deserving and super qualified and talented, but the colleges are going to kind of dismiss it, going, well, she just got it because she knew someone. So it's a fine line when you're dealing with internships, sometimes what is going to be a good one. Finance, business, that's another example. I would say they're generally going to prefer you working as a, stock boy or girl in the back of Target, and then maybe going out and getting some cash register experience, or starting your own company and cleaning out trash cans. And then you can take finance classes or do, anything that you want in the summers. That's going to help kind of bolster your application, but recognize that getting an internship at Goldman Sachs, because again, of a relative or something like that, they're not going to find as impressive because they wouldn't have been earned in the same way. So I know there were a lot of questions about jobs and internships and kind of how these things all factor in. Hopefully that kind of addresses most of those. Are there any questions at all about extracurriculars, work experience, anything on that before we move on? I think we're good. All right, we'll move on. All right, letters of recommendation. So letters of rec. This is going to come from, this is actually something that teachers get, or anybody who writes a letter of recommendation for you. So you usually are going to ask for teachers from junior year. That could be usually always one academic teacher, usually two. And some schools will let you pull your second teacher from a different grade, but they usually want to see junior year because it's the most recent. So for those of you who are currently juniors, hopefully you have schmoozed and gotten to know and built strong relationships with at least one or two of your teachers. If you're younger, it's worth keeping in mind when you become a junior that you want to start identifying which teachers you might end up asking, and make sure you're being proactive and speaking up in class and engaging and supporting your classmates. Because these factors, by the way, most scouts get really high marks because this is part of everything. But this is everything from maturity and motivation and leadership and integrity and reaction to setbacks. So you have the academic element, but you have the concern for others, self-confidence, initiative, independence. These are all factors. So the letter of rec should not come. Most people think I got an A in biology, I'm going to have my bio teacher write it. The problem with that is that they already know you got an A in biology. They don't need somebody to tell them that you're good at biology. What they need is for someone to say, is this a good human being? Is this somebody that we're going to want on our campus in our community? That's what letters are for. So when you're choosing people to write it, a lot of people will have, whether it's their scout leaders or somebody else, it can be, whether it's, your troop leader, it depends. It can be also an older kid sometimes who already graduated writing it. It can be a more formal relationship. It can be a coach if you play sports. It can be a lot of things as an outside one, but you're always going to need those academic as well. So knowing that some colleges will let you get this, and again, they will write a letter in addition to this, but they're actually filling out this form as well. And you can see that it's everything from like below average, average, above average, well above average, all the way to one of the top few I've encountered. And the reality is the more competitive the school is that you're applying to, you want as many check marks in the far right columns as possible. So think about these factors and recognize this is what they care about when you do it. And let's see how that, how you can demonstrate that to your teacher during the time or with your coach. But just keep this in the back of your mind so you don't become a senior and realize no one ever got to know you because you were super quiet in the back of the classroom. Sorry, Siri's talking back to me right now. Okay, so high school academics. I want to just cover some of this because it sounds silly to say overlooked, but I think there's a lot of confusion about how it matters when you're being compared to your classmates, when you're being compared to other people. One of the most common questions is it better to have an A in a regular class or a B in an AP class? And the answer you will hear, especially from all top schools, is an A in an AP class. There's no balance to that. So if you're applying to top schools, they candidly want kids who don't have Bs, right? And there are other schools that, yes, there's kind of a mid-tier that would be happier with a B in an AP because it shows you're challenging yourself and you love learning and you're engaged. That all matters to them. But an A in a regular class for some kids is wonderful, right? And there's kids who are getting Bs in regular classes, and that's great too. It's all about your ability. But if you can do well in an AP class, you want to take more AP classes. You're less of a liability to colleges that way. The way they view it is that you're already taking college level classes. That's what an AP is. So if you can do well in that, then they're not worried about you coming to their school and flunking out, right? So I think when you can take honors, but AP even more so, some of you I know are at schools that have IB, International Baccalaureate program, or dual credit classes. All of these things are good when you can prove to them that you can handle higher workloads and more complicated, more challenging courses. But you need to know your own limits as a student, and parents, you need to help your students know their own limits too. Because the worst thing you can do, which I see a lot, are kids who take a ton of APs junior year and then don't do well. And their straight A's went to heck and they end up with a C or even 2 on their transcript. B's, and now all of those schools they were reaching for are out of question. So just keep in mind that it's about finding where that breaking point is, what you can handle with putting in work, but maintaining your mental health, maintaining balance, right? These are the things that are also extremely important and can get lost when people are so worried about to get my GPA up, because weighted GPAs, they factor in honors and AP classes and you get a bump, but it's only worth it if you do well and stay a happy, sane individual. So one thing to keep in mind, there's some questions about are dual credits better? Do they transfer compared to APs? Or if you have a choice between AP and IB at your school? The problem with this question is it depends. It depends on the high school. It depends on the colleges you're applying to. The reality is APs are accepted almost everywhere, including most UK schools, Canadian schools, almost all US schools. Dual credit works at a lot of places. But what you'll notice, and this is where if somebody wants to have a more one-on-one, we can always dive into it a little bit more, but there are some exceptions and even some colleges that won't take credit within their major. So if you did beautifully on your AP calculus exam and you're a math major, they may not take that AP calculus score because they want you to take intro to calc or whatever it is at their school to make sure you have the foundation anyways. But that just depends on the college. So don't look at that and go, well, I want to be a math major, so I won't take AP Calc. Like, please do. They want to see that, they care. But there are certain times when it won't transfer, and dual credit just also depends on which classes we're talking about. But again, APs, dual credit, and IB are all wonderful if you have the options. Now, the class rank element of this. So a lot of people nowadays are telling us like, look, our school doesn't rank, don't worry about it. The problem is they do behind the scenes. And this is something, if you Google your high school's name and school profile or class profile and last year's graduating class, what you'll see is what they send to colleges. And generally, the vast majority of schools will show a breakdown of GPAs within the last graduating class. So say like 5% of kids had above a 4.3, 15% had above a 4.0, right? Whatever it is and whatever your GPA scale is. So they're breaking it down. So this is how colleges understand also how grade inflation or deflation works. Worked with a kid at a really great public or private school, and she had a 3.65 weighted, and it turned out she was bottom 25th percent of her class. And her parents were like, but she has a 3.65. And I was like, but colleges will know that everyone at her school basically has a higher GPA. So it's not about the number, it's about how she compares. So this has to do, again, if everyone at your school is taking a ton of APs, then they're going to wonder why you didn't, right? Or if you're somewhere that you're not taking it, say you want to be, you're saying, I want to study psychology, and your school had a psychology class and you chose not to take it, that's not only a question mark, but if you did take it and did poorly, and they see a lot of other applications where everyone got A's, that's also a red flag. So they are looking at what you're accomplishing, what you're even willing to try, but what you're accomplishing compared to your classmates. So I always hate saying that there is a competition within your school, but there is. And the reality is, Stanford's not taking 20 kids from the same high school usually. So what you're trying to do is, again, differentiating yourself, saying, look, you need the GPA and the course rigor to even be considered at the top schools, or even, any school. Everyone has kind of a general cutoff point of what they're looking for. If you're above that, it's your extracurriculars, your letters of recommendation, your essays that will actually get you in. But the class rank, just keep in mind, again, if you have a school where you're like, it's really hard and everybody like, there's not, they give out B's, C's, D's, and F's like candy, then great. If you're doing well, or even if you have some of those, but everyone else does too, it's not going to hurt you as much. And similarly, if you're at a high school that does not have AP classes or IB or dual credit options, and you're like, well, if I have no APs, how does that affect me? It doesn't, because if you're at a school that does not offer them, colleges will not hold it against you, given that you had no choice, right? Your parents put you there, or that's the school in your district, whatever it is. You had no control over that. So it is not held against you if something is not offered at your school. Now, one thing that I kind of touched on, but like saying, if you want to study psychology and your school has a psychology class, you kind of need to take it. You need to show them that you are truly interested. But if your school does not have a psychology class, in some ways that's better, because you can now show initiative and be proactive and go out and take one at your local community college or your local state school or online. There's a lot of ways to do that. And then you could say, look, I didn't even have this option, but it mattered so much to me, I went out and found it. So this is a big factor to colleges too, is like, do you love to learn? So they always use the word scholar, right? And to them, a scholar is somebody who loves to learn and is good at it. So if you look like you're always doing the bare minimum and you're not taking the hardest classes, that's fine for a lot of kids in a lot of schools. But if you're capable of it, and this is the other thing where letters of recommendation and test scores, if you are an average student, but you score off charts on testing, they're going to sometimes look at that and go, okay, so the kid's lazy, right? He's capable of greatness, but isn't necessarily achieving it. So there's a million ways to kind of read these things, but just keep some of that stuff in mind. But speaking of standardized testing, so we talked about your grades and your course selection. You're comparing yourself to your peers, right? How do you compare to your classmates? This is how you compare to the country. So the main things here, I'm focusing on AP exams and SAT, ACT. And again, obviously that's different if you're doing IB or dual credit stuff. But for the intents and purposes of this comparison, AP exams, a lot of kids in AP classes will tell me, well, I'm getting an A in the class, the grade on the test doesn't matter, or the score on the test doesn't matter. That is very wrong. So those of you who are in APs, I know this is actually AP week, so that's fun for those of you who are old enough to be in them. But AP exams, the scores matter, because you could have a teacher who's easy and gave everyone an A and didn't teach you anything. right? Or you could have a teacher who's really tough on you and you didn't have a chance to do well because he didn't like you from day one and would never round up on tests, right? Or lost one of your assignments and gave you a 0. The AP exam is your way of showing them what you actually learned compared to other kids who took the same class across the country. And this is saying, did you learn what you were supposed to learn in this class? So take these exams seriously, especially within your fields and your general major. So if you're STEM, any AP science, AP math, you really need to do well. This is something, when you're talking about why to take them, we kind of talked about showing that you're not a liability, that you're a challenge, but the reality is also everyone else's. You know, hate to say with peer pressure, if everyone else is doing it, you should too. But you can see, you know, a 10-year difference. You're not quite double, but you're close. And between 2018 and 2022, it's gone up even more. So what's happening is not only are more kids taking APs, but more kids are taking more APs. So if you ask somebody 10, 20 years ago, how many APs somebody would take sophomore year, junior year, senior year, those numbers are going up and up. So recognize that at a lot of top schools, and again, I say top schools loosely, everyone has a different sense of what that means. And again, some schools would be happy to see 1 or 2 APs. Some are going to expect 12, right? It just depends on where you're applying and what high school you're coming from, but everyone's doing it. And these are the AP courses that exist. It doesn't mean your school offers all of these. Big public schools are more likely to offer, if not all of them, very close. Language is sometimes where it falls short. And then private schools generally have certain ones that are more common. But again, there's some private schools that offer all of them too. So you are always compared, once again, to the context of your high school. If they don't offer one, don't stress about it. But if they do, great. And if it's relevant to what you are good at or what you are interested in, you should be taking it if you feel like you can kind of thrive and flourish in this. With the AP scores, we were talking about why they matter. This is the breakdown of scores. So for those of you who are not there yet and are kind of wondering how this works, it's scored out of 1 to 5. So getting a 5 on your AP score means you got an A in a college class, basically. So everyone's going to be overjoyed with a 5 at any college, whether it's Stanford, Harvard, Yale, doesn't matter. 4s, pretty much everyone's going to be excited about. The reality is that if you're applying to Stanford, Harvard, Yale with a 4, that's not going to keep you out. No one's going to be upset with a 4. A 4, like you can see, is high B, low A, right? It's like getting a 90 on an exam on a college level course. Very respectable. Any school that offers AP credits, and again, sometimes it depends on what your major is or things like that. Everyone accepts 5s. Almost everyone accepts 4s. There are a couple exceptions, but here's where it gets messy. 3s and below. 1s and 2s, no one takes this credit. It's basically failing, right? It's getting Ds and Fs on the test. So if you get a 1 or 2, we don't put it on the application, right? The way this works, you're going to say, I was sick that day. You don't say you're sick that day. You just don't put it, you let them assume that you were probably sick that day. They see you took an AP class, didn't take the AP exam or present the score, not great. But the 3s are the painful ones to me. 3's good. And a lot of colleges give credit for 3s. And so you can test out or test up or whatever you want to do, but a lot don't. And so the 3s, whether you submit 3s, generally depends on where you're applying. But the problem is, even if you're applying to, we'll keep picking on Stanford, Harvard, Yale, if you're applying to those types of schools and you have a 3, if you submit a 3, they're not going to be very impressed. It's, again, basically like getting a C in a college class. But if you don't submit a 3, they're likely to assume it's a 1 or a 2. So for those of you who have not tested yet and still have tests to take in the future, whether it's this year, next year, 5 years from now, do what you can to get the 4s and 5s, because again, the 3 just puts you in this awkward place for a lot of colleges of going, I really don't want to show this, but I kind of need to, so they don't think it's worse. So those are your scores. That's how to kind of read those. And again, everyone has, different requirements for placement or credit. By the way, the reasons to take APs, and get the credit, some kids, again, when you're saying you don't care about the scores, here's the other benefits. You can go into freshman year already a sophomore if you want. But a lot of kids are like, I want 4 years of college. I'm not interested in graduating early, because graduating early will save a ton of money. You're going to save money on everything from tuition, room and board if you're done in 3 years or 3.5 years or whatever it is. But if you still want your 4-year experience, that's great. What you've now done is freed yourself up to either take fewer classes per quarter or per semester, where you can focus on the harder classes, maybe ease into freshman year with fewer classes and still being on track because you didn't have to take intro to calculus or intro to history, right? Whatever it is, you can kind of skip over those. Or you can take fun classes, right? So you have more room in your class, in your schedule to say, I want to take an art history class, or I want to take a sociology class, or try this, or, whatever it is that interests you. Now you have room in your schedule. So AP scores are really useful. And again, if you're looking, who's not looking to save money on college these days, it's so insanely expensive, recognizing that, again, being able to graduate earlier, just not paying for extra credits while you're there does count for something. So that is AP stuff. Standardized testing. So this depends on your year. And since we've got people on this that are from all over the place that have a 10-year gap in age, I'll kind of try to just bulldoze through this a little bit and tell you that some of these things are going to change if you're younger. But the three terms you'll hear: test optional, test blinds, and test required. So we talked about this a little bit earlier on. Test optional, you as the student determine whether you want to submit the scores. Is it going to benefit your application? Test blind, again, means even if you're not interested, or even if you want to send them, they're not interested in seeing them. So this is, you can see the examples are pretty much all California schools. There are some on the East Coast and one or two in the Midwest, but not many. Most are on the West Coast that have gone test blind. This can change over the coming years. And again, there are some on the East Coast that are doing this as well. But tests required, that you have to submit a score, which is what it used to be even a few years ago at most places. But it's starting, people are starting to go back to it, because what happened is they didn't like the classes they got when they were test optional. So they were going back to test required. So when you apply, whatever age you are, the odds are you're going to have a mishmash of these three options. So you generally want to have test scores in your back pocket so that you are ready to submit them if a school either requires them or if they benefit you. The note there is that most schools have only announced policies through 2023. So if you are a junior, most schools have already told you what they're going to do. Some haven't. UT Austin is supposed to be voting on it either this month or next month. So they haven't even decided for this coming senior class. So class of 2023, they're not even sure yet. But beyond that, most schools haven't announced. Some of the Californias have said they're permanently test blind, but the vast majority of schools, 95% in the country, have not announced policies beyond 2023. So just know if you're younger than that, if you're beyond or younger than 2024 graduating class, you don't really know what's coming yet. So, but that's just some terminology for you. A lot of people, I'm sure you've heard in the news that the SAT is changing. It's not going to take effect for another 2 years. It'll be March 2024 for us. So the international test takers, so those who are abroad, so if you're in the UK, you're in Asia, those kids are starting in 2023. So they're the guinea pigs. So what's nice about that for us is we get to look at this and go, okay, so we're learning how things are curved and how they're doing things and what's working, what's not. And it gives us a year to really adapt, but it's going to be an immense change. And we'll talk about SAT versus ACT, but this is, we're curious to see who this is going to benefit compared to ACT. So it's all digital. So you're still gonna have to go to test sites. You can't take it at home. You can sometimes, they're saying you can probably use your own laptop if you want to bring it in, or you can use a school one. It's going to be only 2 hours instead of 3. So they are shortening it. So that's one plus. Here's the big downside. And this is the question mark, because this has never been done for people of high school or younger age. It's going to be adaptive testing. So for those of you who either are parents or have parents who went to grad school, if you think about your LSAT, things like that, the idea is like, if you miss an easy math question, the system, because now it's automated and it's digital, will go, all right, so this kid's not great at math, and immediately go, well, he's not scoring above 700, and we'll just continue to give easier questions, and you're maxing out at a certain number. Whereas now, if you miss the easiest or the hardest question, it's the same. It doesn't have, it has the equal impact on your score. Now you're going to have to be super paranoid that you don't make mistakes on the easy or medium difficulty to get to the hard ones. So this is something that, again, we all understand what it is, because a lot of other standardized testing for graduate students are built this way, but how this would work for, you know, somebody who's 16 years old, 17 years old, we're waiting to see. But the reality is, I think it's going to be more about being careful, because like I said, you can't say 2 + 3 = 6, and then your entire score is ruined if you did that once. So SAT, like I said, there's be question marks. A year from now, everyone will know a lot more. Even in 6 months, they'll probably start releasing materials to start prepping. But right now, it's just a big nebulous kind of topic. So for the current SAT and ACT, we'll compare these for those of you who are sophomores or juniors and even freshmen, because you could test a little early. These tests, once you have finished Algebra 2, you have learned everything you need to for these exams. So for those of you who are really strong in math, do keep in mind that if you take Algebra 2 as a freshman or a sophomore, you are ready to test after that. One of the big kind of frustrations for us, our school counselors or teachers who are like, oh, you're going to be a better tester when you're a senior, right? You're going to be more mature as a test taker. Oh, it's not true. I've never seen that. The reality is, once you've learned all the math that's on the test, and grammar, which by the way, I don't think anyone learns grammar junior year anymore. You either learned it or you didn't. And you're reading, the type of reading you're doing junior year or senior year is not this type of reading. It's not that refined. So you're not building the skills that you might expect to build as you get older. It's about learning the math, and you might need to review grammar because again, not everyone learns grammar. And then with reading, you need to understand how the tests test and what strategies to apply. So some basic differences here. ACT is generally just much more straightforward and moves much more quickly. So their approach is more, do you know it? Yes or no? If so, answer the question. And if you don't, you'll probably skip it and move on, or guess and move on, right? But you're not gonna, it's not a logic question as much. The reading is also more straightforward. So you're going to have, it might be something like, where did red squirrels make their home in the wintertime, right? And in line 27, it will say red squirrels lived in treetops in the wintertime. Not your answer, but it moves 50% faster than it does on the SAT. SAT reading is not what's the right answer, it's what's the best answer. So generally 2 answers are kind of right, 1 is better. So it's going to be more, one could infer that in a different scenario, this character would do which of the following, right? Or which of these gives the best evidence for some argument. So some kids are better at that. Most are not, because this is also something you have more time. And by the way, the reality is because the timing factor is such a big deal for ACT, they're much more stingy with accommodations. So if you have accommodations or plan on applying for extended time, anything like that, ACT has to see those accommodations in place at your high school for a minimum of 12 months before they will approve you, which it's meant to keep people from buying a diagnosis and just turning it in and saying, great, now I get 50% more time, which is great in the grand scheme of things, but some people have had it, but not formally. So just know that if you're thinking of ACT, you will want to get any sort of, neuropsych eval kind of that you can get done, take it to your school, have it on record if you were going to use it. SAT, I don't know that they've ever turned someone down. If you have an actual diagnosis and you have a report and, examination stuff that you can send to the college board, they're like, sure, knock your socks off, because the SAT is not a timing based test. They'll take all the time in the world and it's still going to be tricky. So this is something where SAT, there are certain kids it is better for. What we generally find, especially kids who are going to do any sort of test prep, ACT kids just keep going up. Kids don't usually plateau on ACT, because the more you learn, if you learn a new math concept, the next time you see that on the test, you're going to get it right. And same with grammar. Once you learn who versus whom, it's very straightforward. SAT, half the time kids are not even understanding what the question was asking, and kids tend to plateau on SAT. Now, that doesn't mean you won't plateau above the score you wanted. So some kids wanted a 1400 and they get a 1450, but then they can't get above a 1450, where the equivalent on that would be ACT. Maybe you're shooting for a 30, but you might get a 31 or 32, but if you kept taking it, you'd probably get a 33 or 34 if you're putting the time and energy in. So this is something to keep in mind. SAT, you may just be naturally great at, but prep doesn't usually pay off as much on SAT as it does ACT, to a certain extent and to a certain point. Last thing, science section on ACT. So the science section does not test science knowledge. Seems counterintuitive, but it scares a lot of kids off who say that they're like, I'm not good at science, I don't want to take the ACT. It tests your ability to read graphs and charts. That's what it's doing. So recognizing that if, which bird flew faster according to the graph, bird A or bird B, and that's all you're looking at. It's not about knowing avian tendencies in any way. And they throw a lot of technical terms at you from science, classes and like chemistry and biology, and people freak out about the terms. So whatever it's called, some crazy, technical word, call it Steve. It doesn't matter. They're not asking you if you know that, right? They're just seeing if you could follow along with the logic of what's going on in the graphs and charts and tables and things like that. It's basically interpreting data. Okay, timeline. So SAT, ACT, this is something that most people are, if you're taking Algebra 2, like we talked about sophomore year, you are ready to start prepping the summer after sophomore year, trying to test first half of junior year. You're going to be very happy you did if that's an option, because second half of junior year is rough, especially if you're taking APs. So we always say, like, look, if you can start then great, but if you haven't taken the math, what you'll probably do is wait to start prepping and testing till second semester of junior year and summer before senior year. You really don't want to bleed into fall of senior year if you can avoid it, because you not only have the hardest classes ever, but you also have a million essays and applications. You're going to have so much to kind of digest when you're by the way, the number of essays you write, no matter what you think you're writing, you're going to write more. And the reality is, if we don't know your scores, it's hard to pick a list, right? So if you're like, I'm pretty sure I can get this score, but you don't, it's tough. So you want to kind of have your scores finalized as early as possible. The reality is, if you are a math prodigy and are taking Algebra 2 as a freshman, we have not tons, I shouldn't say tons. We have a lot of students who are done testing first semester of sophomore year. They have the score, they get the score they want, they're done, it's in their back pocket, they never have to test again, and they send that fabulous score to colleges when they apply. So just know it depends on your abilities, your math, but also your schedule. So if you play a spring sport, keep that in mind. You might want to be testing more in the fall, because what I also see a lot is people, whether it's theater, whether it's a sport, who are like, oh, I can't take the test in April because we have a big show or a big tournament. And then they're like, oh, well, June is the week before finals. And then all of a sudden, what we thought our schedule was for test prep went out the window. So just, I always say, look ahead, kind of be aware of what is entailed. And that PSAT, for what it's worth, if you take sophomore year, that's great. It's good practice. It doesn't count for national merit stuff. So if you do beautifully on it, just be aware that, you know, you can get a perfect score and everyone's just going to say that's nice, but it doesn't go to colleges. It doesn't factor into national merit scholarship stuff. Junior year it does. So here's the thing though, you have to be top 1 or 2%. Sometimes the third percentile will fall into semifinalist category, but usually it's top 1 to 2%. So what that means is that if you're a great tester and you are in the 95th percentile, again, no one knows and no one cares. That PSAT score does nothing for you unless you're in that top 1 to 2, maybe 3%. Of all testers. So the reason I bring that up is that so many people feel like they have to prep for the PSAT and it matters so much. If you're a great tester, it absolutely can. It can be a really big differentiator. Top colleges love to see national merit finalist or semifinalist as an award on your application because they get to brag about it. And so you'll see on a lot of top colleges websites, you know, in our incoming class, we had 72 national merit finalists. They like it, but if you are not in the ballpark, so if you're not on practice test, kind of scoring in the top 10th percentile for testing, 90th percentile and up, I'd say honestly, don't stress about PSAT, especially if you're taking ACT, because they're so different that some people are like, but we need to start prepping for PSAT, and it just takes away from ACT and complicates things. So just recognize it's not as important as some people I think are here and are told, and it's just not necessarily true. All right, essays. This is just a very broad thing, but especially in the context of scouting, we were talking about how do you highlight it, how do you bring it up? These are the essay prompts. So common application, probably like 90% of colleges in the US use. There are, I mean, still a big chunk that are exceptions. Georgetown uses its own application. All the UC, you know, UCLA, Berkeley type schools use their own. University, UT Austin in Texas uses their own. So these are not the essays for everywhere, but it is for the majority of schools, even other state schools like Michigan, Wisconsin, all of those are on this. So you'll see it just sort of, if you can't read these, I'll read some of these off, but some students have a background, identity, interest, or talent that is so meaningful, they believe their application would be incomplete without it. If it's you, share your story. Then you have things about obstacles that you've encountered and how did, facing a setback, challenge, or failure affect you? What did you learn? When did you question or challenge a belief or idea? Reflect on something that someone has done for you that made you happy or thankful. How has this gratitude affected or motivated you? An accomplishment, event, realization that sparked personal growth or new understanding of yourself or others. Something that's so engaging you lose track of time, or you'll notice number 7, topic of your choice. The reason that's relevant is that the other ones are not as much. They're good for brainstorming. So if you have something you really want to talk about it. You will find a way. An example I always use for like good essay prompts, because even if you're young, this is really helpful to be thinking of early, because most students, when they get to summer before senior year, when it's time to work on essays, they find themselves panicking a little bit because they're like, I don't know what to write about. If you start a little journal or your parents help you and write things down that happened to you throughout high school, this is going to be more helpful, because keep in mind, most colleges have an additional 2 or 3 supplemental essays that you need to write for their specific school. Some have 7 or 8. It just depends on where you're applying. So most kids on average, if you're applying to 8 to 12 schools, are writing 20 to 30 essays. I've had kids applying to 8 to 12 schools who've written 50 essays because they were applying to schools like Princeton and Stanford and Wake Forest that have, 7, 8 essays each. So it just depends. So I'm just bracing you to know that there are so many essays coming down the pipeline. So brainstorming ahead of time is helpful. The smaller and the more specific, the better. I touched on that a little bit earlier. but I had a student who went to, this was my go-to because this is my favorite essay of all time. I had a student years ago, this also dates me, but he went to New Orleans after Katrina and was cleaning up, and he was so proud of himself. He came from a private school. You know, as he says, he's like, I was this white boy coming in on my white horse, and I was so excited. And he came back and he wanted to write about how he's so lucky. He realized how lucky he was, and he has a safe home and a safe neighborhood and safe all of this. And then we started talking about it more. And it's like, look, he was in a Black neighborhood that was not thrilled that all of these white boys from a private school came in to save the day. And there was a lot of, as he said, kind of racial animosity. So there were these conversations and neighbors yelling at them, telling them they didn't need their help. So the more we talked about this, his essay went from being about how lucky I am, which, by the way, colleges would read that and go, you should have known that. It shouldn't have taken going to, you know, New Orleans after Katrina to realize that. But the reality is, when you look at individual stories and moments, he was finally talking about one woman who would just yell racial slurs at them on a daily basis. And then at the end of the trip, they had some extra energy efficient light bulbs from some homes they had been rebuilding. And they decided to go drop it off on her porch because they didn't think she was home. This kid, my student, was nominated. And so he was like, walked it over, and he goes, but she was home. And she opened the door and she started to yell at him. She saw what he had done and burst into tears. And his essay became about how everyone has pride. And it was the most incredibly mature, powerful, insightful, introspective worldview that you're going to get out of a 17-year-old, right? And again, he cleaned up, he got in almost everywhere and top schools, but it was not, his experience was the same as a lot of other kids, but it was the maturity and insight to recognize that that moment had such a big lesson to be learned, as opposed to, I'm lucky and I live in a nice neighborhood, right? So sometimes when you're at dinner with your kids, or as kids with your parents, talk these things through and be like, what did I get out of this? What moments mattered? Because those are the ones that are going to make better essays and set you up for success. And this can come from scouting, right? This can come from any of your projects, any of your backpacking. It can be anything, but it's the moments that are going to make the story, not a big event. Also, we always say avoid things like your sports injury, or, you know, something broad that everyone has had or most people can talk to and they've read a million of. It's the more unique thing. I did have an admissions director who told me that he reads the essays and the letters of recommendation, because I know from a transcript if a kid's smart, right? And test scores if they're smart, because I read these other things to determine if I want this kid to date or room with my own son or daughter. And he's like, that's how I read these. Are they good humans? Are they compassionate? Are they dynamic and engaging and kind? That's what they care about. So this is where your scouting experience can really help you. And it's going to give you a lot of opportunity and a lot of experiences to pull from. You just have to pull the right ones. And that's kind of the challenge here. So these are some basic things I just want to cover very briefly. We talked about the 10%. Again, it depends on how great you are at any of these things. So if you're an amazing athlete, you have an unbelievable art portfolio, or the best opera singer on, you know, earth, your audition is going to carry more weight at a top school for, you know, opera. But recognizing that, yeah, your portfolio and auditions, if you are in, I call them talent-based majors, so art, film, theater, dance, things like that, they're going to care, right? So make sure that you're putting effort in. If that's something that you think is a strength for yourself, use it. Athletic recruitment is a whole different ballgame, but just know, you know, we have athletic recruitment counselors on staff who can speak to different sports and timelines, but knowing how to maximize this to use sports to get into a better academic school is generally the challenge, and definitely very doable. And I would say really good athletes and really good students can end up at exceptional colleges. Most of my kids who played sports at the Ivies were really good at both. They were not exceptional at either. So just recognize that that is a path for more people than I think some people give it credit. High school reputation relationship. I bring this up because there are some relationships you have no control over. So as a student at a high school, there's a decent chance that your school has an amazing reputation and is a feeder to a certain, whether it's a local state school, Ivy across the country, doesn't matter. You might have that and be lucky. You also can get unlucky and have a situation where your school has a bad relationship with one or two schools. You don't usually know this. So if you have access, you know, if you're young, you won't have access to this yet, but eventually your school will give you a login. It's generally called Naviance. Some schools use a program that's similar to Naviance, but that's 90% plus schools use this. And what that is, it's a program that shows you the average, the GPA and the test scores of every kid who's applied and whether they got accepted, rejected, or waitlisted from your high school. So what's great about that is you can see patterns and be like, is this higher or lower than national average? So if they love your high school and their average, on their website, they say their average incoming freshman has a GPA of 4.2, but from your high school, it's a 3.9. They love your high school. They value it, but it goes the other way too. But I also point this out is that one of the best private schools in the country has now gone a whopping 18 years without getting a kid into Duke. We don't know why. Clearly somebody made somebody mad at some point, and that relationship, that bridge just got burned. It can be that, and by the way, this school sends tons of kids to every Ivy, to Stanford, to wherever, but Duke hates them. And so it could come down to a relationship with the actual high school counselor or the counselor there. It could be that a kid or multiple kids have broken ED agreements, which is when you apply early decision, a binding contract, you were promising you will go, you're signing a contract. If you break that, they hold the school accountable too, because the school had to sign off that they trust you to honor that. So there's a lot of things that can go south, or your school sent a lot of kids to that college and they did horribly. So if they don't do well when they get there, they're not going to think your school is preparing you as well as they expected and may just stop taking kids from there. So again, that can go one way or the other, and usually it's somewhere in the middle. But I bring it up because, that high school, I have some kids who are like, but I really want to go to Duke. It's like, I don't think, at some point someone's going to get in, but it's like, that's not the more likely option. It's like, let's talk about Vanderbilt, or let's talk about other schools that maybe you'll like, that you have a better shot at just because of a relationship long before you. The interview, it depends. The one thing about the interview is if it's optional, do it. So there's a lot of schools, which I think is a little shady, but the way they will set up an optional interview, no pressure, it's not a big deal, but if you don't do it, it's a ding. They're basically using it to see if you're demonstrating interest, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you are excited about a school, you're probably going to interview. If you're not excited about it, you won't bother. And that's how they read it. So if it's an optional interview, always register, always be proactive and sign up for one of the first slots they offer and get in there because they're looking at that. Now, demonstrated interest in social media can kind of go hand in hand. Social media is a little part of it, but it goes both ways. So some colleges track demonstrated interest, some don't. And it's becoming a little less common in an overt way of, have you visited campus? That used to be a big factor, but there's still a couple elements to keep in mind. So if you are applying, let's say you're in Los Angeles and you're applying to Dartmouth or Cornell, those schools, and if you've never visited, they don't care that whether your interest level or not, maybe you can't afford to come visit. That's totally reasonable. But what they're worried about is they accept you and you visit and you're like, I'm sorry, how cold is it? Or how rural is this? And there's nothing going on and you didn't realize that you may not accept an offer. So it makes them a little less likely to take a kid who comes from a very different region or hasn't spent time in the area. So it's not necessarily a direct thing, like don't panic about it. But I bring it up because if you know you're interested in a school that's very different than where you live, they pay attention to that. They're thinking about this. So you would want, if it's a school you're really excited about, you want to go visit, but you can do online tours, you can do online info sessions. But if you visit, you get a sense of the student body too. And when you have to write an essay about why you want to apply to University of Michigan, and you can talk about being in the law quad, and you can talk about this restaurant or coffee shop that the students are at, it makes it a more sincere essay, and it makes it stand out from all the other kids who are like, you have great academics and school spirit, right? So it gives you more, the more interest you demonstrate, the more knowledge you are gaining about the school probably. So it's benefiting you in multiple ways, even if the school does not technically consider demonstrated interest, but there are some schools that do. So you being proactive and reaching out to your regional rep, right, and saying, I want to introduce myself, and when you're in town, I'd love to have coffee, or I'm going to be visiting the campus, could we have a quick meeting? Those types of things, or just asking questions, or asking if you can sit in on a chemistry class if that's what you're excited about. That's all stuff that they're tracking. Now, social media, there's a couple of ways this factors in, and this is a big thing. I see a movement towards more students not having social media, which is perfectly fine, but let's talk about how colleges view this. So first of all, this is kind of half social media, it's more email, but if they on their website have a place to sign up for a newsletter, sign up for it. And the kids, you should be using your email address, your parents' email addresses should be nowhere to be found. Your email address that you will use for college applications, because they don't know it's you if you're using your school email for your applications and some strange Gmail account for getting all this information. So pick an email address now. If you're younger, I say pick first name dot last name at Gmail. It'll be your email address that's professional for the rest of your life, and make it your college email address, right? Have all of your college stuff go to this one email. but start signing up for informational emails from any school you think you're interested in. You know, if you start in 3rd grade, they'll probably think you're a little strange, but if you're like 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, anything, start exploring. It's fine. They're going to like that you're doing it, but they are also tracking if you open the emails and if you click on links and how long those links are open. So Big Brother is here. So just know that if you just sign up for the emails and never open them, it sends a message. They're going to assume that, again, somebody told you to sign up for it and you didn't care enough to read the articles. This is something also I would say, save any email you get from a college that is remotely relevant to your interests. Because again, let's say University of Michigan, you get an email from them and they're talking about this new building that just, you know, that they just built and is going to be opening in the fall, or this new professor who won some huge award, something they're proud of that they're sending information out about. File it away, because in your Why Michigan essay, parrot some of this back to them and be like, and I was so impressed to hear about Professor so-and-so's research on whatever. Again, it's like it's any person, right? If you a person's telling you how excited they are about a new job, you acting excited about their job for them, they're going to be like, oh my God, they listen. So give yourself the chance to kind of prove to them that you're paying attention. That's more with the emails. Social media, back to that. Like I said, goes both ways. It's you following their social media. So again, being clear that you are following that. They check, they try to look at handles and figure out if you are following them or not. If you don't have social media, it's not the end of the world. But the reality is that most colleges assume you do and are just private and are hiding something. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. I always say if you don't have social media super actively, or you have one you don't want colleges to see, you can set one up that's very obvious with your name, very easy to find. And again, use this as your social media platform. It should be like a resume, LinkedIn for teenagers, right? Put pictures of you doing Habitat for Humanity or in scouting with, you know, posing next to your friends and looking wholesome and sociable and all these things, or dinner with your sister and parents and all this. You know, try to avoid red Solo cups, try to avoid the things that could be taken out of context, but make them think of you as that kid they want to date or room with their son or daughter, right? When they're looking for that. Social media makes it easy for them to get a sense of who you are as a person and in a community that you can't get on the page necessarily. So you can use that to your advantage, but again, you can also follow them. So that's one thing that most kids don't think about, and using it, like I said, can be a big pro. All right, this is far in advance for most of you, and some of this is a little bit more just the California schools, more so than anywhere else in the country, have dates that are totally different than every other school for some reason. August 1st, the vast majority of applications, if not almost all, I think they have 1 or 2 exceptions. When you're a senior, August 1st, applications open, you can start filling things out. You'll usually know most of the essays beforehand, but some things won't be released until August 1st. If you're filling out the FAFSA form, October 1st. All right. If you're in California or applying to California schools, the Cal State application's open then. But here are the big ones that really matter more. November 1st to 15th is early action and early decision deadlines. These are the ones that you apply early. They let you know by December, sometimes January. If you do early decision, it can be a huge, huge benefit statistically. So I went to Northwestern, I did admissions work there. One of the things I always try to point out when you look at early decision compared to regular decision there, and you can Google these numbers, this year, I think it was 27% acceptance rate from early decision, 6% from regular. It's a huge difference. So it doesn't mean that less competitive kids can get in early decision. It means that they like kids who are committing. They're not worried about protecting their yield. You're not going to go somewhere else that's better. They know you're coming. So if you are a qualified student, early decision is great. Early action, you're not bound to go. So if you get into Michigan early action, you still have until May 1st to make a decision. So you apply early, they tell you early, and that's nice. The main thing to know about early action deadlines is that's usually tied to scholarship deadlines. So if you're trying to get, who isn't, trying to get scholarship money out of colleges, early action, if the school offers it, you will want to do that. Then you've got November 30th and December 1st, there's just financial aid deadlines, the UC and deadlines, things like that. Most of your regular decision deadlines are January. Some are February, but that's rare. Usually you're looking at January deadlines. April 1st, you're going to have results by then. Usually it's the week or 2 before, but they have to release them by April 1st. And then May 1st, you have to decide. So just kind of thinking ahead and knowing some of these terms and what lies ahead. This is what your senior year is going to look like. And again, for some of you, this is ages away, but just some help on that. And that is it. I mean, it's not it. There's a million hours of topics here we could discuss, but I think this was just meant to kind of walk you through what's on the applications, how things look, what colleges value and how, as somebody who's younger, you can start to shape your high school experience to fill out the application in a way that, again, you had a great high school experience, but you're also going to be what colleges are looking for. I know I mentioned this at the beginning, but you've got the free 30-minute one-on-one consult. It's not a sales pitch. It's fine. I'm happy to just answer questions. I love talking to people about college. So if you have questions that, again, we didn't get into that are more specific or personal, or of course, if you want to know about our services, we do counseling and test prep and all the things. Happy to talk to you regardless of what the topic is. But I think that's it. And let's see, do we have any questions? Anything that I didn't answer at this point, Lauren?
Yes, thank you, Jen. One of the questions we had was, is it more important when doing Eagle Scout projects and community service type things to work on a project that has a bigger reach and impact, but would also have more scouts involved in it, more than just yourself? Or would it be better to do something that's more individual that only you are working on, but would have a smaller impact?
Interesting. That's a great question. My horrible answer is going to be, it depends, because what it's going to depend on is what the topic is and how it relates to your interests. So if, let's just say you are interested in STEM and you're very interested in computer science, and you guys are doing something that somehow relates to that, I would prefer that if it's a big group project and you have a less prominent role, if it ties to your narrative and it ties to your story and your brand. But if your smaller thing ties more to what you are kind of showing on your application you're passionate about and who you want to help, or what academic interests, whatever the connections are, that's something that I would say would be better. It just depends on what fits better with who you are presenting yourself as. So it really is a hit or miss. It just depends on which one you think really, and think about your essay. What can you write a better essay about and really give them a sense of your character and what matters to you?
Thank you. And then our next one is, at what income level does it just not make sense to fill out a FAFSA form?
That's a great question too. Okay, so that's actually a really good question for two reasons. One is it's higher than people think. So you can, depending on the school and depending on your situation, because a lot of schools look at things differently and where money comes from. But if you're over 300,000 a year, you're not going to get need-based aid. But if you're under it, some schools it's more like 150, some it's 2. And it also depends how many kids you have. So the reality is that number gets higher because they're looking at your estimated family contribution, how much you can contribute to college. If you have triplets, they recognize that you can't pay that number 3 times. So it just depends on where, again, your circumstances. But the big thing to know is, first of all, the FAFSA is like redoing your taxes. It's awful. It's not fun to fill out, and it's very tedious. But there are a lot of schools that tie merit aid to your FAFSA, which means you could make $10 million a year, but they need to have on record your financial information to have basically a file open for your kid for financial reasons. So if you want to get that presidential scholarship, you could get it making $10 million a year, but you had to have filled out the FAFSA at certain schools. So what we generally say is just better safe than sorry. There's the FAFSA, which is, federal aid. And then the CSS profile is for private schools and some other, their aid. And you can, we can always go into that in more detail another time. But if you Google those and look at them, I always just say fill both out if you want any merit aid even, because the last thing you want is to think we didn't want to spend that time and then we just gave up $80,000 that we could have gotten at that school in merit aid, which is just based on your kid being awesome and has nothing to do with your financial situation. Anything
All right, we've got one more about the letter of recommendations from the beginning of the webinar. If you know that your troop master or scout master is going to be doing a lot of letter of recommendations, does it make sense to not get one and try to get another one from someone else?
I think there's 2 ways to look at that. One is, how is he going to speak differently, or is he going to speak differently about you than the other people that they're writing the letters for, right? So yes, that's going to happen a lot. They're going to write a ton. But if you have a very strong relationship or have done really wonderful things and they can speak to your character, I still think it's worth it, right? But if you're going to be one of many and they're not going to be able to speak to you as an individual any better than they would anyone else, then I would say look elsewhere. But it's all about, what are they going to put? Think of that grid that we looked at. If they're going to put you in the far right columns everywhere, then you want them writing it. And the reality is, people sometimes ask, well, of course, somebody writing a letter, wouldn't they always check those boxes? No, because schools track this stuff. And if they get, whether it's somebody in scouts or whether it's an English teacher, they're looking at other applicants going, they check this box for everyone, right? And they're keeping notes. So teachers and anybody who's ever written letters of rec knows this. So do think of it from the perspective of, are you one of the best they've ever had? Write it. If you're just kind of a little bit above average, they're probably not going to be the best source. Anything else?
Okay. And the last one I have is how to talk about scouting to people who are not familiar with scouting.
So this is, I think we talked about very briefly at the beginning, which is simply that most people in admissions are somewhat familiar with scouting because they read so many applications about scouting. So what you really want is to think about what it says about you. You're personalizing the experience and what have you learned from it? So most kids come away from it and talk about leadership, but leadership or responsibility or whatever you want to pick. But these are very broad and vague, and everyone who's gone through Scouts has that, or I mean, should, not necessarily, but they're looking at it as like, what have you done? Like, give me anecdotes that really illustrate what you came out of this with, whether it's in your extracurricular line items, right? Or whether it's in an essay. The idea is to make it more than, even if they're very familiar with it or not familiar with it at all, it should be something where like, oh, this kid's capable of blank, right? So you're just trying to give them more specifics and personalized information than saying, I did, you know, these are my badges, or this is what I did, or, you know, our final backpacking trip. They're going to know fundamentals, and it's your job to explain how difficult or challenging something was and why it's so impressive that you did X, Y, or Z. And again, generally compared to other Scouts who've done the same thing. I don't know if that answers it. It's something where everybody should have a different story. Because I will say, from my own personal experience, I've worked with a lot of people who've done Scouting, and a lot of the personal statements initially when I read their first drafts are very similar, right? They again talk about getting lost in the woods and being the one who figured it out, or they helped, you know, somebody's ankle got sprained and they worked through it, or they were, you know, elected or nominated to this position because they were so good with people. It's hard, but like we talked about, a lot of it comes down to that moment and that one specific unique lesson. That's what matters. It's not just Scouting as a broad thing. It's those kind of unique lessons that you learn. I hope that's a tough one, but that's kind of the answer.
That is it from the questions that have come in, unless somebody wants to type one in really quick.
Last chance. Anybody got anything else?
All right, I think that's it.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for having me. And thanks for those of you out east for staying up late. And like I said, reach out if you have any questions. But again, thanks for your time.